I'm Ted Conover, the director of NYU Journalism, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight. About 50 years ago, the newspaper guy sitting right here sat down to write a thriller about a plot to murder the Pope. He called it A Killing for Christ. Born in Brooklyn, he was 32 years old and living in Dublin, having lived in Rome not long before with his first wife and 2 kids. Also about 50 years ago, the man seated next to him was about 10 years old. He grew up in a different part of Brooklyn and would later recount those years in a memoir that children all over the country, including my own, are still assigned to read in school, The Color of Water, James McBride.
Yay, yay.
And he's written several amazing prize-winning books since then as well. As a young man, I think you'll learn James McBride had heard of Pete Hamill. Journalism is about fact, and fiction writing is not. So it might seem strange that we're here on the occasion of the 50th birthday of a novel. By the way, the new edition is for sale here against that wall, and only here after the conversation. It's not for sale anywhere else for 2 more weeks, I believe. But I think more than that, we're celebrating the crafting of stories. And writing narrative has been a growing part of journalism for the past 40 years. These 2 men are both brilliant storytellers. It's important for me to brag about them because they're both humble, a rare and beautiful quality in today's world. Pete wrote an introduction to this new edition. It's in his first-person voice, which I've grown fond of in his writing and in real life as his colleague. I'll conclude my introduction by reading a paragraph of it, which I hope might serve to frame tonight's event. So this is from the new introduction by Pete Hamill to A Killing for Christ. I feel counterfeit reading this, but it's one of the perks of the job, right, James?
There it is, well said.
I loved Rome, its sensuality, the sense it exuded of knowing every variety of sin, and forgiveness, too. In Rome, time itself was visible, not an abstraction. This suited my own beloved profession. As a reporter in my native New York, I'd seen many varieties of horror and violence, treachery and delusion. But I also learned the limits of the craft. My first grade editor, Paul San of the New York Post, said to me once, "Remember, if you want it to be true, it usually isn't." Yes, in journalism, in life. Romans could have embraced that line, preferably in Latin. Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Hamill and James McBride.
So Pete, here we are. You got the pillow. I didn't.
I brought the pillow.
Well, we've talked earlier about this. Both Pete and I come from Brooklyn. He lived not too far from, actually I lived not too far from where he grew up. And I tell my students all the time, and I'm so glad to see so many of them here, that you can learn more from 15 minutes of Pete talking than you can learn from 15 weeks of me talking. So we're gonna make Pete talk today, and I'll try to keep my comments to a minimum. So I'll just begin with this. The Regis High School in Manhattan was founded in 1914. So St. Regis is a Jesuit school. And if you listen to their website, they list 68 famous alumni. Among those are Adrian Bassara, Reverend Donald Harrington, who was the former president of St. John's, and many others. Far down on the list, they don't mention that the name of Pete Hamill is not an alumnus of St. Regis, even though he went. And the reason why he's not an alumnus of St. Regis is because of a story that he wrote when he was 14 called Seeds of Death. He got an English assignment to write, how I went to Albany and all this. And he didn't complete that. Instead, he wrote a story called Seeds of Death with 2 characters, one named Nocera and the other one was named Chuck Taylor. Nocera was the person who was murdered. Chuck Taylor was the guy who murdered Nocera and buried him in Pete's backyard. The principal of St. Regis was named Reverend Charles Taylor. And that ended Pete Hamill's formal education. So all these kids, these young people, and I see students going way back 10, 12 years that I've had, I'm so happy to see them. They really, what they want to know is how to get where you are. And so we were talking earlier today about narcissistic solitude, about living in a house. And so when you grew up, what did you have to do that you wish these kids, these young people today had to do?
Be a part of the neighborhood to start with. Wherever you're growing up, whether it's a posh neighborhood, whether it's a tough neighborhood, get to see it one at a time. Meaning the people should be looked at one at a time. We were lucky where I grew up that to end up as a writer, that in my neighborhood there were people characterized as characters. See this guy? He's some character, this jerk, you know. And we would laugh and try to figure out what he meant and what was said in the criticism. And it was true. There was always some identifying characteristic. He picked his nose with a fork, you know, something. But also, there was a way of looking at people, and this was lower middle class neighborhood, with lower working class neighborhood, and seeing them for the way they behaved with their families, learning from them the way the structure happened sometimes, and the way they behaved with others, because it's the way we behave with others that can sometimes define us. And we would see people with mean, nasty streaks to them and stay away from them. But we learned from the other people.
Was there a psychology? Was there did you learn? How did you learn to listen?
I think that's one of the gifts that you got in a time that was not over mediaized, if there is such a word. There was no television yet. The biggest mass medium was radio. And radio gave us all kinds of things, including talk, how people talk to each other. But it gave us music. It gave us attitudes towards the world and the way we live in it.
Yeah, but
never came from anywhere else.
Yeah, but you learned to loose your imagination early. What those who haven't read your memoir don't realize is that you were a painter as a kid. You were an illustrator.
Yeah.
And so you went to the school, which is now the School of Visual Arts, and you went to Pratt, and you did most of this when you were working full time on your own as a 17 or 18-year-old. Did you see the world as an artist then, or as a painter, or were you simply just struggling to survive and curious about things that came before you? Because that's what these young people want to know. They want to know, if I'm working 7 hours at Reuters, or 9 hours, or if I'm carrying, coffee for Wolf Blitzer, what do I do,
The one thing I learned fairly early in the dividing of work and a vocation, to put it in a fancy way, was the value of a nap. Because I worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard for a year when I was 16 and 17 as an apprentice sheet metal worker. Thank God for the world that I failed. People might be picking metal out of their heads as they walk down. But it was a job that taught me how to work, how to show up on time, how to punch the time clock, how to do what the boss or the foreman or whoever it was wanted me to do. As trivial as it might seem, as trivial, and to do it with no complaint. It was after work that the part of me that had imagination began to work. And a lot of that came from comics. Came from reading comics in the golden era of comics, great comic books like The Spirit by Will Eisner, by the works of Simon and Kirby and so on, that are continuing today in variations with Black Panther and other forms that came out of something 70 years ago. But it was also the great era of the comic strip, which was a narrative strip. Terry and the Pirates, Dick Tracy, Smiling Jack, where there was a narrative every day, and usually 3 or 4 panels, and they were set up perfectly for a young would-be writer later on in progression. This happened, and this happened, and as a result, this happened. Get tomorrow's paper and find out what happened, you know. So somehow those were built into me. And I was also a reader. I read the popular fiction that was around. I read Sherlock Holmes. I read Bomber the Jungle Boy. There were like 10 books about, under the name Roy Rockwood, which had to be a pen name for, you know, guys working at the Journal American on weekends. And the sense of a story began to embed itself in me, that there were stories in the world and I should know what they are.
Well, isn't that part, though, based on your own life as an Irish person, as an Irish American? I mean, I've known as an author, having toured with Irish writers, that you might as well, when I toured with Malachi McCourt,
Yeah,
you know.
that's a good example.
I mean, you know, the first time I toured Australia with him, I said, let me go first, Malachi. You better go first, Malachi, because I'm kind of funny. He said, okay, all right, no problem. He went out there, people were, they were crying, they were laughing so hard.
Oh, yeah.
And then I staggered on stage. So, I mean, maybe, is that part of the
That was
Irish
a tradition, yeah. There was a tradition of storytelling back in the old country. Back before the British conquered Ireland, there was a whole tradition, both written and built into the life of the community.
Well, can I stop you there for 1 sec? I want my students to come back to the story element. We were talking about story construction, but I want to go to the Irish thing, but I don't want to get lost. So somebody remember that when the Q&A comes up. The whole business of Irish Americans in American literature, and I've been thinking about this all week. You know, you are not that greatly decorated given your talent. I mean, I got the national book, I mean, I got this, that, and the other, and really, when you look at the scope of your work, like so many writers write the same book over and over and over again. You write a different, I mean, you play a different solo every time, and we talked earlier about music, and I was wondering if part of what powers you and maybe writers, quote unquote, like you, is the whole business of what it means to be Irish in America. The whole business of Irish history that is sort of planted in the book Forever, for example, and in other parts of your work, this shoving, pushing against this impenetrable wall, if you will, of absolute prejudice against a group of who were, you know, going back to the 1850s, the Know Nothing movement and all that other business. The Irish were always like the second Negroes of America.
Yeah.
You know, is that part of your makeup? And if so, how does a young writer translate that into their work? And is it good to have that?
It's very good to have that. In my case, my parents were both immigrants, both from Northern Ireland, both Catholics, who were forced into exile by bigotry. It was as simple as that. it had driven them, not the first Irish ever to come for the same reason, but in Northern Ireland, it remained worse than it was in certain other parts. And although they didn't come together, they met here at a dance. And they both had the same kind of demented sense of humor. My mother saw my father sitting alone at this dance at Prospect Hall on Prospect Avenue in Brooklyn. And he was sitting all by himself. All his friends were dancing with girls all over the place. And she went over to him and said, "Let's dance." And he looked up and said, "Ah, I can't dance." And she said, "Ah, neither can I." And took him out to the dance floor for the rest of his life. She was to me, the great editor of my life. You know, she would hear me talking, come up from the street from Brooklyn and she'd say, "What's going on down there?" "Nothing," I'd say. She'd say, "Sit down. The word is nothing. 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 Say it. Nothing. Okay, now you can get up." And later, when I had my first newspaper job, delivering the Brooklyn Eagle on 5th and 6th Street near the park, she would also edit me when I started to try to write the way the guys in the newspaper wrote. So she was an amazing force on me. And I think in your book, The Color of Water, the effect of mothers on immigrants is absolutely
It's amazing.
dead on.
Yeah.
It's so common to everyone. If you're writing about Jewish immigrants, or Protestant immigrants, or Irish, or whatever, there's always a strong woman running the household. That's it. The men didn't run the households. The men didn't say, "Did you get your homework done?"
Right.
Very few of them. Some of them did.
Well, I mean, the evolution of women in America is something that I, can't profess to know a whole bunch about, especially, now, but, I mean, especially in this day and age, dominance, but it seems to me that the way your parents raised you with this whole business of you have always been on the outside. Like you've never been, I mean, and I don't know enough about the literary community in New York to really speak really that, candidly about it, but you've never been a person who's kind of been in the flow of the quote-unquote literary community. You've always kind of circled outside. You've kind of known when to dip in and dip out. And I wonder if it's because of these characters, this whole business, everything in your work, you're always pushing to the good. And you said something to my class many years ago that I tell them all the time. You say, cynicism is poison. It's okay to be skeptical, but cynicism will just spike every dream you had.
Yeah.
And so, is that something that you learned over time? Is that part of who your parents were? Is that part of being Irish, or just part of being Pete Hamill? Or where does that come from, and why is it important in terms of story?
Well, it certainly was part of being Irish, but it was also true of being Jewish. Right. It was also true of being Latino when the early days, people coming up from the islands or in from Mexico. Nobody came to the United States to live worse. They came here because they could live the fullest extent of their lives with all the possibilities that could be in your life without ancient history clamping down and saying, you can't do that. You're Catholic, or you're black, or anybody could be what they wanted to be here. And in spite of, terrible things that have happened in violation of that, it's still in my heart and in my experience remains true. I think we're going to get past present time lousiness and redeem these things that are happening and be better than we ever were. I really believe that because it was true for me, it was true for all my brothers, it was true for my sister, it was true for everyone that I knew that started with nothing and ended up with a bank account, which itself was an unbelievable accomplishment. So I remain an optimist without being full of self-delusion.
Well, we talked about needing to learn from what you can't do. There were lots of things when you were a young man that you couldn't do, you were forced to do, and then you learned that on the fly. I often wonder to myself how many more books you would have written if you hadn't had to work so hard all the time. What is it about the work thing in the Irish people? What's it?
It's their favorite four-letter word.
But I think about that often, and because I know a lot of these young people, they feel a certain emptiness in their lives, and they feel a certain, they want it tomorrow, first of all, but they feel a sense of hopelessness when they see how big the machine is. Why should I do it? It's already been done. Why should I write it? It's already been written. And I don't even know where to write anymore. The newspapers are dead and magazines don't want me. So what do we say to these young people? What do you say to these young people? There was nothing there when you got started. I mean, newspapers and magazines existed, but they didn't know you. So what do you say to young people when they say, I can't do it, or it's just, where do I go?
First of all, I would tell them, you gotta try. If you want to do something, you have to try it. You can't immediately eliminate yourself from any possibility of accomplishing anything and expect anything to happen. It's ridiculous. So you got to give it a try. That doesn't mean that you leave common sense out. You don't, if you're 4'2", you're not going to make it in the NBA. Don't even try in that case. But if it's a question of learning a craft first, because without craft there's no art. You need craft first. How is the thing made? How do you make it work better? How do you say, I can do something like that, but I would really do it this way because I see it differently. To be able to do that and make yourself push and really say, no, that's not good enough, and do it again, and do it again if necessary. Don't be afraid of looking at something and say, I didn't do it in one marvelous moment. There are few marvelous moments in art or in craft. You gotta learn it. You gotta, and that means in our complicated art/craft, it means looking at the people who've done it so well in the past. The past isn't just 2 months ago. You can learn something from Mark Twain, and you can learn something from H.L. Mencken, and you can learn something from a whole lot of guys who arrived before you were here, and who learned from the people who were here before them. And I think knowing what the existing work was, making yourself into a kind of self-taught scholar in some work is something able to be accomplished, but something that you'll get every day or every week. You will learn something new. When I dropped out of high school, I knew it was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever done, but I was going to try to do it some way that would refute that and try to learn something new every day. I got the habit, which I still have, at 82, that I got to read who did what to whom in the paper before I can get on with the rest of my life. And because something new might happen there, even when I see a story that's as old as the hills, see that there's some new variation on it. That helps me to believe that it's worth still trying to do the thing I did most of my life. It takes me longer. What I used to do in 2 days or 2 hours, I would do in 2.5 days now.
Well, I feel that way when I go take a whiz. It doesn't happen.
Exactly. Exactly.
60, it's just not what it was.
Especially if the car's waiting.
Well, for those of us who go right, make the mighty leap from fiction, from nonfiction to fiction, I'm sure there are many in this room who have done it or who would like to do it or who try to do it. It's very hard for journalists to do it. And one of the reasons I think it's very hard for journalists to do it is because of the whole business of cynicism, which we just talked about. But you've done it successfully for a long time. And in this first book, A Killing for Christ, you did it very successfully. And there are long bursts of really wonderful literary, I won't say backstory, but literary inner thought of characters without getting hung up in like 4 pages describing a leaf. And that's really tricky business. And I wonder if there's maybe some tips or some reminders that some things that we meaning me too, all of us could use in terms of making the jump from nonfiction to fiction.
Well, it obviously is a question I approach
differently for each.
Yeah, but in the first novel, which I had never tried to do before, I had written short stories and learned a lot from great short story writers. I had very much learned a lot from Chekhov and from Turgenev and others, and then translating it into the world I knew, or even through certain writers. Irwin Shaw is a great short story writer, another Brooklyn guy, and wrote. I once interviewed him when he was, had a long career. I said, how could you in your 20s be writing stories like The Girls in the Summer Dresses or Sailor Off the Bremen? How were you able to know so much? And he said, I knew at the beginning that if it happened to me, I had to make it about somebody else to give it distance. If it happened to somebody else, I had to write it about me to give it intimacy. And that really explains what you can do with fiction that you can't do with journalism. You can't do the one other thing that you mentioned in The Killing for Christ. The inner lives of people. Journalists can't write that. They can't. They can suggest it. They can talk to people about people and try to get someone else's attitude about why so-and-so behaves this way or that way. But they can't get into the inner lives. That takes writing fiction. To get into you can get close. And I love certain journalists. Nobody has written better about Sinatra than Gay Talese, for example, without interviewing him. You know, just writing around him and creating them in rich detail. But if you want to get into what you've learned about other people in the course of a life, fiction is the place that allows you to get into inner lives, because so much of what happens to us is bottled up inside.
Well, that's true, and that's one of the difficulties of journalism, of straight journalism, straight journalism, if you will, or nonfiction, where you can't push in. You're stuck sort of writing about the trombone player instead of writing through the trombone player.
Yeah.
So if fiction allows you to, okay, assuming that all works, how do we do it now when journalists go out with a camera and a pen and paper and are supposed to bring home bring home the bacon? It feels like they're bringing home less bacon now with pictures that I don't even look at the pictures when I
Canadian bacon.
No, really, I mean, I don't understand how, I'm not complaining, because by the way, it's always easy to criticize someone else. It's very hard to create. It's easy to be a critic. It's hard to create. And we're talking about creation now in terms of journalism and fiction. How do you move characters from one room to the next? If your inner story is already, you got it cooking now, and you think you know where the end point is in fiction, but you're not sure. In nonfiction, you do. Mostly.
Yeah.
The house burns or it doesn't. The fireman dies or he doesn't.
They go to jail or they don't.
They go to jail or they don't. Donald Trump falls down a flight of stairs, or maybe he doesn't.
People cheer.
But, in fiction, Donald Trump falls down a flight of stairs, hits his head at the bottom, and then he never gets up. But in fiction, staying with fiction, how do you work that out? I've read some of your short stories, by the way. They're just magnificent. And in 1,000 words, you do it. You travel. Short stories are hard to write.
Harder than novels in certain ways.
They are.
Yeah.
So, how does short story, for example, translate? How do you push short story into long form fiction? How would you do it? Or how do you think of it?
Well, again, I go back to my comic book phase. I used to use index cards and lay things out on a bulletin board, chapter by chapter, just to get some sense of what's going on. And that was very useful, because you could say, okay, I got 3 static scenes in a row. I can't do that. One of them has to have some action, and he has to walk down the block and knock on a door or something.
Mm-hmm.
But then I started using these storyboard pads that you can get in art supply stores. And they were even better, because there were boxes, and I could write dialogue in the bottom and begin to see the shape and rhythm of what I was writing. But I did not want to have everything spelled out. Otherwise, why sit and write the book if it's all in the outline? So you leave a lot of space different places. And looking at great writers, looking at Hemingway or somebody, you see what he was doing too to make the transition, using the lessons of journalism, but using it for fiction. And he began to, so effectively with short stories, more effectively than a lot of the novels, to create something with the minimum use, with talking about the dignity of the iceberg, depending on the fact that 7/8 of the weight is below the surface. You don't have to spell everything out. It doesn't have to be a 900-page novel that leaves you punch drunk after chapter 91.
Well, you said something when you visited my class about sentence structure, and I wish I could remember. I wrote it down. I don't think there's anyone here. Maybe Ryan was there, but no, I guess not. You said something about sentence structure. You said something like, when you're creating sentences, and I can't remember, but I'll just sort of paraphrase it, you know, he threw the hat out the window, so he jumped. It doesn't, you don't say that. You say, he jumped because he threw the hat out the window. It's something like, you know, this way that you write with an enormous amount of muscle. There's no fat. So can you just, I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, particularly with sentences, again, because I had Latin in Regis High School.
Oh, you got something out of it.
Yeah, I got something out of it. But there was a rhythm in Latin, and I was hardly fluent in Latin. I was an altar boy too, so I could say Adeum qui laetificat juventutum meum. You know, I can do that and say, what the hell does that mean? You know, but they almost, the sentences in Latin almost always ended with a hard word. So it was better to say, I hit him with a rock than I threw a rock at him. Because at him is a boring sort of phlegmy sound. So, but if you could get a hard word to provide natural punctuation, I hit him with a rock, you don't even need the period, you know? So I was very conscious of that. And I was also trying to teach myself about the craft. So I would take a paragraph from Joseph Conrad, let's say, A Storm at Sea, and transform it into a snowstorm on land. Every noun changed, every verb changed. The structure of the paragraph remained, and I knew how that structure happened. And I learned enough about putting the effort in that it stayed with me. So there's a way that becoming a writer or trying to be a better version of yourself every time out is an accumulation of what you're reading, what you're hearing, what you know from other writers who you admire, what you know from the past, and what might be knowable in the future. And that gives you so many options.
Well, there's in jazz, we talked about music earlier, and we were talking about Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa and the jazz drummers. When they teach drums in school, they teach you to go and that's a drum roll, you know, you've learned, and they teach you these patterns. And what makes a great drummer is not his ability to deliver these patterns, but his ability to forget these patterns and power through and make his personality part of the music. That's why Gene Krupa was such a great drummer, and Buddy Rich was such a great drummer, and that's what Pete is saying to you. He's saying that stories have structure, and you see what other writers do structurally. You learn it, and then you forget it, and you say, okay, I know it, and now I'm going to try to shape it in a way, having this knowledge to shape it, and he can go back to comic books and narrative strips in comic books. But what he's saying to you is, learn how to play the melody first, and then forget the melody, and solo. But you've got to learn the melody first.
I started to tell you earlier, but I used to read, because I was very interested in jazz music. I used to read Downbeat magazine, and Downbeat had an interview one time with Gene Krupa.
A drummer, he's a jazz
drummer. And the interviewer asked a very good question. You keep the rhythm for the band. How do you keep the rhythm yourself? And he said, I have a little couplet of that I repeat all the time. Lyonnaise potatoes and some pork chops. Lyonnaise potatoes and some pork chops. Lyonnaise potatoes and some pork chop. So the first year I got my tryout at the New York Post, working nights where all embarrassment could be hidden. I would be writing a story and with my weird 2 or 3 finger typing machine, and I'd go, some pork chop. Some pork chop. So you learn from the other things that are coming into your mind, anything from Latin as an altar boy to a Gene Krupa interview in Downbeat can contribute to the evolution of a style.
Well, let me see how are we on time? Are we over time? What's happening?
We're good.
Do we have time for questions?
We do.
All right, any questions from the audience?
We have a microphone as well.
Okay.
Hello? Oh. I don't have a question, it's more of a comment, and I think I spoke to you about this earlier, but I wanted to repeat it publicly. And that is that, 2 things. One is that,
I need my glasses.
to James's point, I think that you have, the thing that I've always taken from your work is the indelible rhythm of your sentences, and thinking that, I could kind of pick out one of your lines. If you gave me a line from 10 different writers, I could probably pick out the one that was yours, just because of the rhythmic structure of it. And that's been something that was informative to me as a young writer. And the other is an anecdote that I reminded you of earlier, which is that I met you in 1999 in a bookstore, and I ran into you. We got into a conversation. I asked, "Are you Pete Hamill?" And you said yes, and we got into a conversation about your book, Piecework, which I told you I'd read probably 4 or 5 times. And we started talking about New York and the history of New York, and I specifically remember somehow Stephen Crane being sent to cover the Spanish-American War for the Hearst newspapers. It was kind of a wide-ranging conversation about New York's literary history. And it was very inspirational to me as a young writer. And that story, that interaction wound up having a different kind of resonance because it took place in the Borders bookstore on the ground floor of the World Trade Center. And when the towers went down, I think people thought about a whole lot of things. But for me, that conversation was the first thing that came to mind.
That's amazing.
Because we were having a conversation about the history of New York in this place that wound up being central to a whole other era in the history of New York. And I just think that, of course, I would wind up talking to Pete Hamill in this place about this thing. In retrospect, because of you having such a connection to New York City and being one of the most prominent voices, I think, articulating so much of what's happened in the city. And I just am really appreciative of your example as a writer.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would add to that, what's your name again? I'm sorry.
Will.
I'm Jelani Cobb.
Jelani is, you know that name, don't you? Well, it says a lot that a black guy other than me likes Pete Hamill. That's 2 of us in the world. But it does bring to mind the whole business, the whole business of race, which is one of the reasons why this country is in such a bad fix right now. And I've always admired in your work, I think mostly from your mother on down, this whole business of how you handle the complexities and the complicated business of race. It could not have been easy. And I wonder if you might have a few words of wisdom about that for some of our students here, because the students here at NYU come from all over. And it's a new world now. Asian just doesn't mean you can do what's Asian? What the hell does that mean anyway? I mean, what does that word mean? We have students from all over the world now, and we have, and they are a new voice. And so, what do we tell these young people? What do we tell them to do?
See clearly. Don't just glance at the world. Don't just look, nod, go somewhere else. See it. See what people seem to be doing. Learn to read body language along with the language written on paper. Get to know people one at a time as often as you can. And remember that if a mother loses a child at 2 years old in Manchuria, she weeps just as badly as somebody in Brownsville if the same thing happens. There's a human center to all of us that we have to celebrate more and stop with the yapping and cheer each other on when we do well. Make us realize how dumb we can be when we don't do well, and how ignorance gets people in trouble more than intelligence. It's a lot, but you got to listen to the people that have survived this whole thing of living in a world like we're in. We have to know not simply who got a first novel advance, but you know, you got to read Cicero too. You got to read the classics. You got to read the people who have survived epoch after epoch and are still readable and still have something to teach us, and thank them for it. And then pass it on to whoever you want to know about it, your grandchildren, your friends, strangers. If they say, who the hell is Cicero? You just say, it's more than just a town where Al Capone lived in Illinois, you know.
Well, you know, I often remind my students here that this very neighborhood, this very institution, 30 years ago, NYU students used to have to sprint to get to class. And not 4 or 5 blocks from here, the Great Triangle Fire, where so many young Jewish, Italian, and Irish women died for nothing really, because of greed. And that history constantly repeats itself. And journalism teaches you to look at what's happening now in the millisecond in this age where you pull out a cell phone. Just remember, the act of pulling out a cell phone is almost an act of ignorance now. Really, I tell my kids in Brooklyn, when I teach in Brooklyn, I have a program at my church that I've been running for 5 years. I don't even allow cell phones in the building when I'm there. I tell my kids, these are kids age 7 to 13, 14. I say the act of pulling out a cell phone is a sign of ignorance. You can learn more from the Daily News and the New York Post and the New York Times. If you just read those 3 newspapers for 6 months and read nothing else, your grades will improve.
Yeah.
This whole business of tweeting and tweeting and squeaking and Facebook, I don't have none of that. I was just talking to Tom Robbins. I said, I'll send you a text. He said, what text? What are you talking about? You guy's been writing for 40 years. Is he here? There he is. He said, I don't send me no text. What are you talking about? I'll kick you in the teeth. I mean, this is one of the great reporters from the Daily News. He didn't have, information is not money. Knowledge is money.
Yeah.
If I walked up to you and I said, you know, here's $100, and you say, thanks a lot. Thank you very much for the $100. But if I walked up to you and didn't give you $100 and said, you know what, man, my car broke down last week and the tire, I couldn't figure out the tire size to my car. And I'm giving you $1,000. You just haven't figured it out. Because when you go to write the story about the guy whose car broke down, or when your villain's car breaks down, and you don't know the difference between an R15 tire and an R16 tire, and you got to pull out your phone, you've already lost flow. You've already lost flow. Anyway, next question. I had preached my sermon. I earned my money, God damn it. That's good. All right. Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot for running tonight. Pete, if it wasn't for Tales of New York, my life would be vastly different, both as a person and as a writer. Just as a kid in the Bronx, you know, reading about people who talk like the people that, those same snippets of conversation that I listen to every day, you know, the people that you wrote about look like the people that I live with, and were the people across from me on the bus and all that. So Tales of New York, I'm a huge fan of your journalism, but Tales of New York was
Thank you, man.
a life changer for me.
Thank you very much.
So I teach journalism at Western Connecticut State University, and my take is I don't think that journalism has changed as much as the media. That journalism has remained the same, should remain the same. That we should still focus on the fundamentals, and it's just how it's delivered. So whether it's writing on a cave wall or a brain chip in our brain, that's the delivery of the story. Do you think that's the same? Do you think that we need to focus on storytelling, the fundamentals of accuracy, writing in a concise way? Do you think that as things change, the more things change, the more they stay the same, or do you think that might be what us dinosaurs tell kids today?
Yeah, well, obviously, the medium is changing. The newspapers are slowly fading away in some way. But that doesn't mean journalism has to fade away, and it doesn't mean that we have to lose the sense of the local. I think more and more the necessity for local coverage is demanding itself. Our politics, for example, the Democrats are wondering what their strategy has to be. Bringing back service-oriented politics. You help get a bail bondsman for some kid, you help get a lawyer for another, and you help someone get a job.
Mm-hmm.
You got them for life,
Politics is getting the street light fixed in front of somebody.
Exactly. Make it happen. But I do think there's an awareness of it now that's stronger than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And that everybody's not trying to start the new hot website. That using the old truths to find out what's going on in our world, who controls our world, who has to be challenged, who has to be embraced. All of that is still amazingly valid and amazingly necessary if we're going to live in a democracy and if we're going to live in a place like New York,
Well,
the capital of people who are not like us.
well, to your question, does that mean that the whole business of developing strong local news is something that we need to focus on more here at NYU?
I think so. I agree with that very much.
You think so as well? I happen to agree, but I mean,
And
the way
it's
you
value,
Right.
not to do it because it's where you can get a job or something, but because it's something valuable.
Well, not only that, we talked about this earlier, if a person is living on the 45th floor and they're getting their groceries delivered and they're getting their news.
By drone.
I mean, by drone. If you don't even have to if you take the funk and dirt out of your life, you're not going to be a great writer, period.
Yeah.
Just forget it. If you can't stand in the line at the grocery store and do those kinds of things, if you get your meals delivered that way, you're never going to write anything good.
Yeah.
So, but the other part of it is that local news really plays into the whole business of gerrymandering and the state governments, playing a part, and the Democrats losing all kinds of space and ground and so forth. But how we do that is something maybe some of the faculty here can talk about later. How do we develop local news that's powerful and potent and accessible and cheap so that people can get to it, maybe through sports, maybe through local politics, local schools, and some of the young people here. This is an idea. If I was a young person, I'd say, you know what do they have right now? They have something called patch. That doesn't really, maybe this is it. Someone is I'm giving you the $50 bill now, but it's disguised. You got to figure it out. But that was a great question, and I just want to push on because I don't want to run out of time without, getting some other things in. So Give me another good question, somebody. In the back, sitting down, and then the gentleman behind him. Yes.
Thanks. So changing focus a little bit then to craft. I'm kind of curious how your take on essential themes that run through literature. There's a book by Thomas Booker called 7 Basic Plots. Talks about like voyage and return and slaying the dragon and things like that. Or Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces looks at themes that cut across all cultures and all times. Do you have any perspective on, in approaching whether fiction or nonfiction, themes or kind of plot lines that you're looking to address, or do they emerge naturally, or any kind of take that you have on that aspect of the craft?
I think the answer to that is all of the above. Sometimes you're reminded of something. You say, God, this is like Macbeth goes to Yonkers, you know? And other times, it's we come here to bury Caesar, not to praise him. You know, there's different ways that the past and what you've read and absorbed continues to emerge and rise up in you in different ways, usually in fresh ways, a new version of an old song. And that can be the kind of thing that leads to something spectacularly new. I always think of wonder what would have happened if George Gershwin had lived to be 70 and not died at 38. And if he had had a chance to play with Charlie Parker, what would they have done? You know?
Well, I'll add to that when you're stuck, to the young man, oftentimes it's a lack of reporting.
Yeah.
That jams you up, because your characters won't move around.
Yeah.
They won't move around. They don't live in your imagination because you don't know enough about them. So and oftentimes plot will push out of character if you're that deep in. Depends on how deep. It depends on the situation. But I'm familiar with the books you talk about, and I tell young writers all the time: if you're stuck, report and report more. Young writers just don't report enough. You know, what did Richard Blood used to say? Check the room, eat the food. Count the room, eat the food. Count the room, eat the food, and report deep. You know, let your local librarian know that you really are a good friend. Your librarian, in terms of fiction, is your best friend. And the other point that Pete made about music, because I talked to Sonny Rollins, who's still alive, about, I don't know, once every couple of weeks. It just was a fluke that I got to meet him, but I got to meet him. And these guys, they remind me of each other. And I'll tell you why they remind me of each other, because when John Coltrane, who was one of the great American saxophonists, developed something called the patterns of sound, where he would play these and he created this sound that you hear in the song Giant Steps, which is studied in colleges all across the country. And Giant Steps really screwed people up, because Giant Steps was a key to how Parker did and all this, because it took musical structure and broke it down into chords that are played arpeggiated on the horn, arpeggios, dum, 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 okay? Well, Sonny Rollins never did that. Sonny Rollins learned to play these chordal patterns on his horn, and he learned to play like Charlie Parker. He learned to play like all of them, and he does it all, but he's the only pure improviser in jazz. And look at his body of work. His body of work is wide. Everything from, he's wider than Miles Davis, wider than John Coltrane, because Sonny was a pure improviser. He learned the structure, and then he forgot about it. And so Pete, what he did was he learned the structure as he learned it, as it was, and then he said, well, I want to do it this way with this person. And then he followed the character in fiction and let the character color the structure and embellish or fill in the structure, and even create plot from character. For example, in The Killing of Christ, there's some surprising twists and turns in the book, in addition to some 1960s scenes that are like, why wasn't I there? I mean, but you can see the point, as a novelist, I can see the point where the writer says, I'm just going to let this go. I like what this person's, I'm not going to solo yet, let him. And he just follows the character, and then you can see the window closing, and you can see the writer back out and move on.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
But everybody needs an editor. And one of the great examples, to me, also came from music. Coltrane was playing with Miles Davis. And Coltrane was into one of those stages where he did these solos that went on and on and on, and Miles would look at his watch. Miles would walk over on the side, have a cigarette, come back. Finally, he gets to Coltrane after one of the shows, and he said, John, you gotta do something about them solos. Yeah, I know, Miles, but I get into the music and it just has me, and I can't get out of it, he said. Take your mouth away from the fucking horn. It's my favorite editor story.
That'll do it.
I love Coltrane
Oh,
with
the
John
Coltrane.
Hartman. I love that album.
Johnny Hartman?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a
With
classic.
Coltrane.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
jeez.
beautiful. The fellow in the back with the purple?
Thank you. Following up on structure, how do you think that working for a newspaper all these decades ended up affecting your novel writing, if at
Yeah.
all?
Oh, no, it did. Because the basic structure of newspapers stories, who are the 5 W's? Who, what, where, when, and the most impossible why. So every novel, in a way, has to meet that standard in my head. You know, I want to know who these characters are, who. I want to know what they did. I want to know where it happened, because the sense of place is something that you learn from journalism and carry into fiction. And the why is the most challenging of all, to try to get into the deepness and complexity and sometimes absurdity of human motivation. But it's worth the effort if you can find out to get the whole 5 W's, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
Well, we have time for like a couple more questions. Very quickly. All right. Where is it? Okay.
Hey, thanks a lot. Pete, one of the my favorite editor stories that you told me was involved a new editor that you had. I asked you how this person was, and you said, she's great. You were working on a book, a novel, and I said, why was she great? And you said, because something wasn't quite right. I had my character coming into a room and throwing his wet raincoat on the couch, and I wasn't getting the sound right. So we broke for lunch, and we came back into her office, and she had taken a raincoat and soaked it and was throwing it on the floor, trying to get the sound right. And what that told me is about your supreme devotion to craft. You talked about it tonight, and I wonder, as a journalist whose career you made because of a story that I wrote 32 years ago about a boxer named Ricardo Lopez, and you pointed out the specifics in that piece and why you liked it. And I feel like part of this craft of writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is getting the word exactly right, right? There's a huge difference between almost the right word and the right word.
Boy, that's for sure.
So thinking about my favorite book of yours, which is A Drinking Life, and how that book is infused with this rich tapestry of very specific details from a time and place in Brooklyn that whether you grew up there or not, you can't help but love and appreciate. What advice do you have about finding the specifics, remembering things? I mean, I remember some interviewer asked you, how in the world did you remember all of that? So that kind of is my question. Like, how, as a young writer, and there are plenty of young writers here, how do you encourage them or point them in a direction of triggers that will force them to remember things and get very specific and clear details that they can describe? Is it photographs? Is it music? Is it talking to people? I mean, what are the triggers that get you to remember these great details?
Senses, the senses, the smell, the vision, the look of the place, the sky, whether it's night or day or what time of the day. To get the senses absolutely clear brings the paragraph or the section that you're writing to full life, because everybody is aware of the senses in their own lives, the ones who are not writers, but who are attracted to the kind of rich writing that we're capable of when we're doing our best. So I think it really is about, you know, taking the senses and using them as a kind of a key to what's missing.
Well, that's really hard. I mean,
Yeah.
So do you go back physically to the place to walk the earth there, or do you just pull yourself in?
Yeah. If it's for example, in Killing for Christ, he flashes completely back and forth to Saigon.
Right.
You know, because he was a chaplain in Vietnam. And of course that I had only been there for 5 weeks, but I was working this way, you know, soaking up as much of the rhythms and sounds and textures of life in Saigon, trying to imagine myself into the life of a citizen there, to say, what does he see when he wakes up in the morning or hear?
Well, the interesting thing about The Killing for Christ, because I read it, and it was your first novel, and I read a lot of your short stories as well, is you push into like, I don't know if you call it backstory, but inner story here, with extraordinary. Can I read a little bit for you? Okay, this is after the protagonist in the book is a priest who discovers. I'm not going to tell you what he discovers, because then you won't go buy the book right over there. Get your money out. But he's talking about when he got his priest training. I don't know what it's called really. What's priest training called? Seminary. Okay.
Yeah.
No one knew that 2 years of philosophy were really 2 years of discipline and extracted obedience. There was nothing of Ayer or Wittgenstein, no mention of Sartre or Kierkegaard. You learned to keep quiet, to submit, to have some vague quality called faith, and they gave you 4 years of theology after that to make it set, like the plaster in cheap statues of Christ. It did for a while. I mean, this kind of, this pushing back into this guy's agony about his faith and his sense of disillusionment, his lost illusions with faith, it played out over the course of maybe a page and a half, and then the writer moves on. The 2 questions I have, one is personal, which I'll ask after that, but the question I have here is, in this case, this is not based on your 5 weeks or however long you were covering in combat in Vietnam, combat era, in combat zone, but this is more towards your own life and your own feelings about religion, which begs the question that I have to ask: Are you religious at all?
I'm not exactly, you know. I would love that there would be an afterlife. As a matter of fact, I bought a plot in Greenwood Cemetery, right next to Boss Tweed. Because if there's a life after death, who wants to be with a saint? I'd rather be with a rogue and at least have a lot of laughs. But there's the other part of me that really started afflicting me when I was 11, when I first saw the photographs in Life magazine in one of the stores of survivors of the Holocaust. And as I got to know about the Holocaust, I said, how the hell, where is this God, this all forgiving, all knowing, all powerful God? Where was he when 6 million people, men, women, and children, were being slaughtered? I couldn't absorb both, even though I was an altar boy, and then went to a Catholic high school. And it was a struggle I had that was resolved with a kind of yes, but not yes.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not gonna bust chops over it. It's not.
No, I'm not thinking that way at all. I don't mean that. I mean that it's a confusing.
Yes, of course. I agree. I work in the church, and I mean, I can tell you that ministers are just they're horrible people. I mean, so I understand. It's just hard to live not thinking that's. Listen, we all know the thoughts and prayers bullshit that's been flying around in this country. We know that religious right has become circuses and clowns. I mean, it's pathetic, but. I think I have my own issues with it, so I won't get into that. But we're running out of time, but I do want to leave with on this note. Does anyone have any question that they really have to ask? They really want to? Okay. Oh, there is one? Okay. Here, is that right here, Bernard? Okay.
I'm wondering, I'm in Professor McBride's class right now. I guess the greatest takeaway in his class is that writing is a lifestyle and that a writer is never off duty. And so what I'm seeing now in my life is some of the most interesting people that I meet, I don't exchange numbers with and I'll never meet again. And so fiction is about like pushing into the character. So how do you push into characters that you only meet for 15 minutes?
Well, I do a number of things because I knew how to draw and had been to art school. I would sometimes draw a character, draw different versions of the character and hang it around somewhere, lean it someplace and live with it for a few days. And then I would try to write a kind of who's who sketch of who the character was. And if it sounds too familiar, then that's somebody else's novel that I'm imitating somehow. But I also learned from art school that there were 4 stages of learning everything: imitate, emulate, equal, and surpass. So if I looked at what I was trying to do with the character, and what made the character go through those stages, all in my head, all with scribbles, with notes, with possibilities. Somehow something would come to life, and I said I could do it that way, and move on to the next step was how the weather was, the other stuff.
Good. All right, just so I want to share these names with the people here. Phil Garland, Norman Isaacs, Andy Cooper, Wayne Barrett, Murray Kempton, Jimmy Breslin, Richard Ben Kramer, Michael McCallery, Bill Boyle, Dennis Hamill, your little brother.
He's here, I think.
Is he really? Yeah. Oh, man. Let me tell you something. When Bill Boyle of the Daily News died, Bill Boyle was a good friend of mine, and I was at his funeral. And I have a Bill Boyle Day every semester. All my students know this. Bill Boyle he was the manager. Huh? Everyone except you, we don't invite you. You guys drink too much, but the regular people. No, no. It's a day where Well, I talk about story structure, and I talk about how I met Bill Boyle, and how he came to New York, and how we were friends, and then he died. And then I give them Jack Morrissey's edited version, Jack Morrissey's obituary written in the Philadelphia Daily News. And then I give them the eulogy that you wrote in longhand. Dennis Hamill wrote a eulogy in longhand on yellow pieces of paper, and he read it at Bill Boyle's funeral.
Wow.
And it was just, I give it to my class every year. I give them the obituary. I say, this is an obituary. This is how you write the story of someone's life. And I never even met you before, but I got it somehow. I got it from somebody.
I met you outside the church.
Oh, well, there it is. I played at Boyle's funeral. And I'll tell you another story about that. When I was at Boyle's funeral, the priest there caught me cursing in the bathroom because I was so upset. I was in the bathroom with the piano player, and I was saying, I said, Dick Cheney smokes cigarettes for 5 packs a day, son of this fucking guy. And Boyle, man, he's only 56. This is bull. And the piano player was looking at me funny, and then the toilet flushed, and the priest stepped out. And he didn't say a word. He just looked at me, and he stepped out. And then when he delivered the eulogy, I was sitting up there when he was talking, and they had Boyle's laid out, and he was a much loved man, because a lot of those guys, there's some hard-bitten dudes who were sobbing. And the guy said, I want to tell you something. I'm hearing stuff here about, Boyle, he's so young, blah, blah, blah. He said, look, if you love someone, he looked dead at me, he said, if you love somebody, they never die. Yeah. And I tell that to my kids, if you love someone, they never die.
Yeah, yeah.
Bill Boyle was an editor at the Daily News, and what was so great about him is that he loved literature. He loved music. He loved movies. He was a real Renaissance guy. And he brought all that love for the arts to a crime story when he was editing something. He wanted details. He wanted you to bring it to life for him.
Yeah.
He worked really hard with young writers, telling them to work harder on the lead. Get rid of, he said, I don't want any commas in the lead. I would say, this is the Daily News. Get to the point and make the reader get to the second graph. And then they'll finish the story. And he would make you flush it out and make sure that you really did the reporting. And he believed in details, and he wanted those. And he wasn't a guy that talked out of the corner of his mouth. He hardly spoke at all. He was like the most laconic guy you ever met. But when he had something to say, it was really important. He was a great editor.
I'm glad that you guys met. I'm glad we got around to talking about it.
My other brother Brian is here.
Oh, yeah? Where?
Yeah, he's up here.
Well, why don't you bring him up so we can see him?
And he taught.
Where's he at? Oh, there he is.
Oh, over here. Yeah, I can't see with the lights.
Well, this is from me and to your family, from the staff here at NYU, your colleagues, from your students, from the Bill Boyles of the world, from the guys and men and women who work with you. I tried to think of a way we could, and I was going to play you a song, but I don't feel like carrying my sax all the way up to Jersey. So this is from me and everybody here. And this is for you. You might as well hear it now, because when you ain't drawing oxygen no more, it ain't going to count. And this poem was told to me by an old black man when I wrote my first obituary. I wrote an advance obituary about a guy named Inky Wilson at the Wilmington News Journal. He was an old black guy. And I told him, I was so stupid, I told him I was writing an advance obituary. So he pulled out a cigarette, and he's smoking, and he said, oh, this is funny. And then one day we had to use that obituary. But this is what he said before I left. He lit a cigarette, he had his little, whatever he was drinking there, and he recited this poem, which I'm sure many of the Irish people here know. It's written by a woman named Will Allen Droom Gould. An old man going a lone highway came the evening cold and gray to a chasm vast, deep and wide, through which was flowing a sullen tide. The old man crossed in the twilight dim. The sullen stream had no fear for him. But he turned when safe on the other side and built a bridge to span the tide. Old man, said a fellow pilgrim near, you are wasting your strength with building here. Your journey will end with the ending day, and you never again will pass this way. You've crossed the chasm deep and wide. Why build this bridge at evening tide? The builder lifted his old gray head. Good friend, in the path I have come, he said. There followed after me today a youth whose feet must pass this way. This chasm that has been as naught to me, to that fair-haired youth may a pitfall be. He too must cross in the twilight dim. Good friend, I am building this bridge for him. Pete Hamill, you've done a lot for this city, and you've done a lot for these young people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I can't stand it. Thank you all. Thank you. Hasta la batalla final. Thank you so much. I'll tell you one last newspaper story. I was working nights, and there was an cranky old guy named Dexter Teed who wrote the obits and wrote a kind of Press Digest column. Always wore a bow tie, always cranky. And we had a cranky editor, right at the copy desk. And one morning, like 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm working on something, I'm mayonnaise potatoes. And Dexter Teed stands up and falls flat on his face. Everybody goes, Christ. And the editor at the copy desk said, get me the clips on Dexter Teed. It might have been the last thing Dexter heard.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.